The primary issue here you're talking about is the amount of debt now in the system.
Yeah, I think the two biggest issues are the debt in the system and the fact that unlike the prior decade, we're in a commodity bull cycle where we don't have oversupply, we have undersupply. And so it's kind of like we're marking to market now some of this debt, right? So the whole point of sovereign reserves is that sovereign reserves like treasuries and these other types of bonds, they're basically supposed to be able to buy you, goods and services at a reasonable price for a long period of time, right? I mean, that's kind of, and you can just simplify it and say buy energy at a reasonable, duration. And if those reserves are no longer able to buy you, if they just buy you less and less energy every year, because now there's an energy shortage, that threatens the whole system. That's really kind of the first time you've been in this environment. Now you had a big energy bull market in the 2000s, but that was mostly from the demand side. We had a strong growth in emerging markets. We had a weaker dollar that kind of allowed that emerging market boom to happen. And supply came online pretty quickly, in different ways. And so that kind of tested the system, but it didn't break the system. Now that we have actually undersupply, this is probably the biggest challenge that this very debt-based system has ever faced.
But they can increase supply, right?
Over time,
Yeah.
yes.
Right. And because what I don't understand is how do you have a sudden undersupply? Is it just because of the way what's happening in Ukraine and Russia, and therefore there's an undersupply in specific areas? Because there hasn't been a sudden increase in demand for energy. The population they haven't seen a sudden massive increase in population. We haven't seen some massive economic growth. Or is it because we had a slowdown for COVID and we're essentially trying to restart markets?
That's part of it. So it's a bunch of factors coming together. So price is set around the margins, right?
Yeah.
So it actually takes rather small differences to affect the whole environment.
Right.
And so going into, pre-COVID, the world was oversupplied with oil. It's because shale oil ramped up very quickly, and investors were willing to do so unprofitably. They just kept saying drill, drill, drill. They were free cash flow negative. Saudi Arabia tried to flood the market with oil to try to kill the shale oil producers. It didn't really work.
Right.
So basically, there's just more oil than the world knew what to do with. Prices were low. And then, that started to get worked out, but then COVID happened. And we have, of course, a massive collapse in demand with the lockdowns and things like that. And then we had a sharp resurgence in demand. But a lot of supply, some of the supply was killed during that period, right? So some of the weaker players went out of the market. And there's also increasingly, a lot of it's not really sociopolitically popular to invest in hydrocarbons now, right? So a lot of large pools of capital divested. And then there's a big movement to shut down nuclear plants and things like that. So we're undersupplied in many ways. And you had this big demand resumption while supply didn't really, fully catch up to the same way that demand did. And then natural gas it's a less fungible market than oil. So oil, you can put, you can move barrels around pretty readily. There are pockets where it's challenging if there's no pipelines, if it's like inland really far. You can have these weird anomalies, but for the most part, oil is a pretty global market. Natural gas is a lot harder to transport, so it's a lot less fungible. It's more expensive. And so even before the war, natural gas prices in Europe were spiking tremendously. And so it was a shortage. Russia was unable to supply enough compared to the demand that Europe had. Russia was still supplying contracted amounts for the most part, but Europe demand had upticked, and there just wasn't really a lot of spare capacity. And it was being met by LNG from the United States and elsewhere, but that takes billions of dollars of infrastructure to build in very long amounts of time. It's a very complex process. So there's only so much LNG capacity to do that. So there's an arbitrage opportunity there, but it's just structurally limited. And over years and billions of dollars, you can build more. So eventually that gap can be closed, but it's a less fungible market. And then, so that's already was a challenging situation where we've not invested for years while demand slowly ticks up. And particularly it came up rapidly after the lockdowns came out. And then when you throw the curveball of Russia invading Ukraine, suddenly one of the biggest oil producers, one is they could shut countries off. Two, countries want to shut themselves off from them. And suddenly the market got even less fungible than it was before, both for gas and then also potentially for oil. And so, you have both supply side problems and you have a resumption in demand after. And this, this is not really unique. If you go back in history, commodity cycles tend to go through these boom bust periods where, prices are low, so nobody wants to invest. And eventually, kind of like with Bitcoin, where, if it's like super low and it's all going into like hodler hands, eventually you just run out of liquidity and you get like a price spike. Same thing happens in commodity markets, but it takes decades where, prices are low, nobody's investing. Eventually, just supply is just dwindling and demand keeps inching up. And eventually you have a squeeze and prices start going up. A lot of capital comes into the space. Eventually it gets over exuberant, you overbuild, and then, that's what causes the next period of low prices. And this is generally like 15-year cycles.
Yeah, because there has been talk of $300 barrels of oil. I don't know if that'll be achievable. Where are we at now? Is it like 140, 150? Is it higher?
Last I saw it was 118, but it changes every day.
Yeah, but I'm certainly if you get to $300 for a barrel of oil, there'll be a lot of investment in that infrastructure.
Yes.
But that takes time. Investment in nuclear, I mean, I've got no idea, but I can imagine it can be a decade to build a nuclear reactor with all the regulatory processes to go through and the investment and the cost. So your view is this could take 15 years to get us back into an energy bull cycle?
I don't know about 15, but I think that this is going to be the story for the decade. That I think that's going to take a lot of new supply coming online. And it's not even just, so energy is the key area.
Yeah.
We're also going to need more copper and more nickel and things like that, right? So it's and then, energy is also used for fertilizers.
Yeah.
That's where it ties into the food angle. And also anything, even transporting food, that takes energy, right? And so even making wind turbines, making solar panels, this is hydrocarbons are used to do that, right? So that's a way you can either burn hydrocarbons or you can take hydrocarbons and say, we're going to put them into this project that will give us more energy over, decades, but it does require that upfront investment to, dig mills out of the ground, construct the things, So I think there's got to be a lot of investment in real world goods this decade. And it's not unusual for this to happen. It's only unusual for this to happen when debt is so high. That's kind of what makes this cycle, we have to go back to like the 40s to kind of find a similar type of environment, 1940s.
Yeah, it's a super complicated problem. I recently interviewed somebody called Alex Epstein, who wrote a book about fossil fuels, and his belief is that humans flourish with an abundance of energy, and we need to massively overproduce in terms of energy. And he is of the belief that we should continue to burn fossil fuels, and we should mitigate the effects on the environment and on the climate. I struggle with that as somebody who has researched and looked into the impact of climate change, but I also see that the downstream effects of not having enough energy. But at the same time, I mean, today my brother forwarded me an article from India where the temperatures are so hot at the moment, it's having an impact on agriculture, and there's dehydrated birds dropping out of the sky. And trying to match those two problems is super complicated. Feels to me like nuclear is a solution. And you're pro-nuclear. I believe we've had that conversation before.
Yeah, for the past few years.
Yeah, so it feels like that's where the investment needs to go, but there's going to be this massive impact in the short term. I can only talk about things I've read in the UK or things I'm aware of. People cannot afford to fill their cars up and maybe travel as much. I even saw one story, Lyn, that just didn't cross my mind. So there's a chance a bunch of swimming pools in the UK will close down because they cannot afford to heat the pools. It's too expensive. Or they have to raise their prices and people won't go swimming, or they have to let staff go, or they have to have the pools a bit cooler or open for less hours. These are these downstream effects that never even cross my mind, and I'm sure there's hundreds of these, thousands of these.
Energy is one of the few things that touches almost everything we do. I mean, basically, all of our economies are around using energy to basically make the world more suitable for us. And just from the math, nuclear is one of the safest and most abundant ways to, have clean energy. There's also solar and wind work very well in certain types of environments. There could be breakthroughs in things like, algae or things like that, just basically ways to harness energy.
From algae?
Algae, yeah, biofuels.
Okay.
You can say, for example, genetically modify algae to be more optimal for biofuel production, things like that. There's all sorts of long range things. There's deep geothermal energy, right? So there's geothermal energy where you tap into, say, Iceland, where it's near the surface. But there's also theoretical technologies. If we get better at drilling, we could go down deep enough so that almost anywhere in the world you could get geothermal energy, which is rather clean. And so there's long range things that could potentially solve this. But in the near term meaning a decade or more, the world's kind of pretty short on hydrocarbons, and I think it's a challenge because we can talk about what we want, but also it's like people will literally starve if we don't, as a society, have enough energy. And so it's I think people's views on energy is going to be challenged this decade. I think it's kind of these rough times are kind of what tests different beliefs about what we want to do or where we want to go. And so there in some ways there always is a trade-off between environment and abundance, but there's obviously better ways. There's ways to optimize that as much as possible. I mean, for example, natural gas and coal, even though they're both fossil fuels, are not the same. I mean, one is generally cleaner than the other, for example. There are different ways to optimize this over the long run.